Daniel Carter did not look like a fighter, did not look like someone made to carry the weight of Earth's pride. His arms were thin, his chest flat, and his voice soft. Among the line of strong men and women who trained in the trial grounds, he looked out of place, as if he had been brought there by mistake. The others laughed at him during drills, some mocked him with jokes during meals. Even the trainers shook their heads when they saw how poorly he lifted the training blades and how quickly he ran out of breath. When he was asked to spar during the first weeks, Daniel was beaten and pushed into the dirt over and over. He was slow with weapons, missed blocks, slipped while standing, and fell flat when he tried to throw a punch. The other cadets slapped their knees in laughter. Some of them were so much taller and stronger that Daniel looked like a child standing among giants. They asked what kind of mistake the Queen's trial had made by allowing him to join. Daniel knew what they thought of him, and each laugh pressed him deeper into silence. He had grown used to being ignored throughout his life. As a boy, he had never been strong or fast. What he did have was patience. Yet in a world where might and muscle were honored above all, patience was worth nothing. One cold night, as the trainees sharpened their weapons under the glow of fire torches, Daniel could hear men talking about him nearby. Samuel, a wide-shouldered fighter, boasted that Daniel would be the first to fall when the records of combat began. Others agreed. Even Caroline, a tall and well-respected warrior, said she pitied him, not because of his weakness, but because he looked too tired to even fight for tomorrow. Daniel sat quietly, sharpening the edge of a dull blade that he knew he could never swing with power. He wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere to run. The day of the choosing was the day their lives would change. All trainees stood in a circle, their armor polished, their stance proud. At the center lay the ancient mark of the apex hunter. For years, this presence had chosen a companion among humans during the trials. No one fully understood how it chose or why it chose. Only one thing was certain. The chosen would carry a bond unlike any other. A bond that would shape the future of Earth itself. The air was filled with hush. Even the cruelest voices went quiet. The Queen herself stepped forward. Eleanor Hart was not a warrior made of muscle, but her voice carried a power greater than steel. She ruled with steady judgment and the weight of Earth's honor upon her shoulders. She lifted her hand, and silence spread across the grounds. The choosing began in a way that all had expected. The lights shimmered, and every heart waited to be seen. Strong men stood tall, flexing their arms and widening their stance. Women skilled in the art of combat raised their blades high, hearts pounded in hope. Each of them prayed that they would be the one honored. Then something happened that no one expected. The mark shined with a sharp glow, and its pulse settled not on Samuel, nor Carolyn, nor any other champion. It turned and pointed to the one person who was least ready. It pointed at Daniel Carter. For a moment, the silence was so deep that Daniel thought he must have imagined it. His chest burned, his eyes wide. He looked around, searching for someone else, anyone else. But the glimmer did not shift. It remained upon him alone. The bond settled into his flesh, and he felt weak and alive at the same time. Uneasy laughter broke through the crowd. Men clapped their thighs and shook their heads in disbelief. Women giggled as if at a cruel joke. Samuel threw his hands in the air and barked, asking if the apex had gone mad. Caroline crossed her arms, her eyes sharp with surprise, though even she smirked as if the event was nothing but foolishness. Daniel stood frozen. This was not a mistake he could hide from. This was a choice he did not ask for. Every eye burned into him, every sneer sliced into his heart. He felt the weight of their anger and doubt. The firelight flickered across his face, and for the first time in his life, Daniel felt a spark of something new rising in his chest. He did not know its name, but it pressed him to stand straight as the Queen's voice rang clear. Daniel Carter has been chosen. And with those words, Earth's weakest no longer stood in the shadows. He stood at the center, where all could see him, and none could look away. Daniel did not sleep that night. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of 1,000 stares pressing into his chest. He had been mocked before, but this was worse. Every man and woman who trained with him now believed the choosing was broken. The strongest had spent years readying themselves, yet the mark had chosen him, the weakest of them all. He could still hear the laughter in his ears, louder than any war drum. He wondered if even the Queen doubted this strange choice. But when morning came, he walked out to the training yard. The sun was hot, the ground dry beneath his feet. The others were already lined up, whispering to each other. Samuel gave him a grin, filled with mockery. Caroline shook her head and said Daniel looked like a child holding a sword too heavy for his hands. The words burned him, but for once, he did not look away. He gripped the hilt of his wooden blade and stood in silence. The queen entered soon after. Eleanor Hart observed them all with calm eyes. She was no young woman, yet her presence carried more strength than any warrior. She told them plainly that the choosing was never a mistake. If Daniel had been selected, then there was purpose in it. She ordered that he continue the trials with the others. Her voice was sharp and left no room for argument. The drills began. The warriors lifted heavy shields, struck with spears, and charged across the sand. Daniel joined, his body aching with each movement. His arms shook when he swung his blade, and his legs stumbled when he tried to keep pace. He fell behind again and again. The sound of laughter returned every time he dropped into the sand. Yet something inside him had changed since the choosing. Each time he fell, he forced himself back up. Each time his hands slipped, he tightened his grip harder. The jeers of the others no longer broke him as before. There was a fire inside him now, faint but steady, and he could not let it go out. Samuel made it his mission to crush Daniel's spirit. During sparring, he struck harder against him than against anyone else. He slammed him to the ground and shouted at him to quit. Others cheered Samuel on, enjoying how easily he knocked Daniel down. But every time Samuel beat him into the dirt, Daniel rose with blood on his lip and dirt on his skin. He rose without complaint. His body wavered with weakness, but his eyes grew sharper each time. Caroline, though she gave him no kindness, began to notice. She saw that though he was slow and frail, he did not give up. He did not argue, and he did not beg. He faced them all as if losing 100 times did not matter, so long as he stood one more time. It puzzled her, though she said nothing aloud. That night, Daniel sat alone by the fire pit. His body hurt everywhere, his hands covered in blisters. He stared into the flames while the others laughed together in groups. Part of him wanted to vanish into the shadows, to rest, to surrender. Yet every time he tried to imagine walking away, he remembered the glow of the choosing circle, remembered how it had picked him in front of all. He had not chosen this path, but now that it was his, he could not turn his back. The queen passed by that evening, her footsteps quiet on the stone ground. She saw him sitting there, broken but unyielding. She did not speak long, only placed her hand briefly on his shoulder. Strength does not always show in the arm, she told him with a steady voice. Sometimes it shows in the heart. Then she left him under the firelight. Those words followed Daniel into his sleep. He could still hear the snickers of his rivals, still feel the pain of his bruises, but there was something else now. A whisper in his chest, urging him to rise again with the dawn. And so when the sun returned, Daniel Carter carried his wooden blade into the yard and took his place. No longer hiding, no longer lowering his head, while the others wondered silently what the choosing had truly seen in him. The day of the blood trial was near, and the tension in the camp grew heavier with each passing hour. The trainees had been warned many times that this test would not be like sparring in the ring. The blood trial was a contest of survival, and it would separate the true warriors from the pretenders. Those who entered would be injured, and some would not return. For years, the strongest men and women of Earth had proven themselves through this trial, and now Daniel was expected to face it as well. When the announcement spread, mocking voices rose quickly. Samuel laughed louder than anyone, telling the others that Daniel would not last even a minute in the trial grounds. "The boy will trip on his own feet before he even meets an opponent," Samuel said with a sneer. The others joined in their laughter, and though Caroline did not laugh with them, her silence spoke of the doubt she still carried. Daniel felt the fear in his belly, but he carried it differently than before. He no longer lowered his eyes when they mocked him. Instead, he listened carefully to the words of the trainers, memorizing every instruction with care. Where the others trusted their strength, he clung to patience and attention. He studied the way Samuel swung his hammer, how Caroline moved her feet when she struck, and how others rushed too quickly into their attacks. Every mistake was sharp in his mind, and he stored it quietly for the day of the trial. When the morning of the trial arrived, the queen herself stood above the arena. She watched with her calm and powerful eyes as the gates were opened. The ground inside the trial pit was layered with sand and stone. Weapons of wood and steel were scattered across it. The air filled with shouts as the trial began, and the warriors charged forward with the roar of battle. Daniel did not run as the others did. He moved slowly, studying every angle, keeping his breath steady. His opponents were large and eager to strike, their weapons clashing against one another in violent blows. Samuel was like a storm, swinging his hammer and knocking every fighter that came close to him to the sand. Caroline moved with speed, cutting through her rivals with quick steps and sharp strikes. Daniel watched them all, keeping to the edges while the first wave of battle filled the pit. Some of the strongest laughed at him again, pointing out how he lingered at the sides instead of joining the clash. They thought him a coward, but Daniel was waiting. Saw how quickly those who burned their strength grew heavy in their movements. Their arms slowed, their breath grew sharp and ragged. He did not waste his energy. Instead, he struck only when he had to, choosing moments with care. He used short strikes, quick turns, and never let himself stand still long enough to take a crushing blow. As hours passed, the pit that had been alive with shouting and steel grew quieter. Many strong men lay in the dust, gasping for air. Women who had swung their blades with fury now clutched at bruised ribs and bleeding cuts. Samuel remained sweating and raging, his hammer heavier in his tired arms. Caroline continued as well, panting but sharp with focus. And then, to everyone's shock, Daniel still stood. He was not unhurt, but he was alive and steady on his feet. The crowd outside the arena began to change their voices, or they had laughed. Now they grew quiet. They began to see that Daniel had not simply been carried by chance. He was not faster, he was not stronger, but he had outlasted those who had mocked him only days before. Samuel's voice broke the silence as he shouted in fury. He charged at Daniel, his face red with anger. Everyone expected Daniel to fall as he always had, beaten by sheer force. But when Samuel's hammer came down, Daniel shifted with sharp timing, letting the strike smash into the sand. Samuel stumbled from the weight, and Daniel struck with all the strength he had left, using speed and placement rather than power. His wooden blade hit the side of Samuel's ribs, forcing him to the ground in a painful shout. Gasps filled the air. Daniel stepped back, shaking from both fear and fire. Samuel struggled to rise, his face twisted with rage, but he could not. And so the trial leaders declared the round complete. The unexpected truth became clear to everyone that day. Daniel Carter, the weakest, had survived the blood trial when many others had not. Even the queen leaned forward on her seat, her hands resting together, her eyes resting not on Samuel or Caroline, but on Daniel. Though sweat poured down his back and his chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, Daniel stood taller than ever before. For the first time since his life began, he was not hiding from the eyes that watched him. This time, they could not look away. The trial grounds were still heavy with silence after Daniel's victory. The crowd left in confusion, whispering among themselves about what they had seen. Many refused to accept the outcome. Some called it luck, others called it a trick. They could not believe that Daniel Carter, the same boy they had mocked as the weakest, managed to last when so many others had fallen to exhaustion and wounds. That evening, the anger of some warriors began to grow. Samuel nursed his bruised ribs, and his pride suffered worse wounds than his body. He gathered men around him who felt cheated, who hated the thought of the queen honoring Daniel in any way. "The boy will bring shame upon us all," Samuel said with his deep, angry voice. His followers agreed. Their words spread like poison through the camp. Caroline, however, stayed apart from them. She still doubted Daniel's strength, but she had seen something in him that could not be ignored. While others fell in their pride, Daniel kept standing. She did not speak in his defense, but her silence was noticed by many. Daniel himself sat on the edge of the campfire with his arms wrapped around his knees. His body still shook from the trial, and his muscles burned with soreness. Yet his eyes were clear. He remembered how the crowd gasped when Samuel fell, how even the queen's sharp gaze lingered on him longer than any other. For the first time, he was not hiding. For the first time in his life, he felt something different, like a fire that could not be put out. The next day, the mood in the camp shifted darker. Whispers of betrayal began to crawl through the ranks. A small but dangerous group of men poisoned by envy spoke of removing the queen and claiming rule for themselves. They argued that if she allowed someone like Daniel to rise, then she was unfit to lead the trials. Samuel clenched his fists and promised he would see Daniel broken, before bowing to any choice that called the weaker greater than him. At dusk, those same men armed themselves not only with training blades, but with sharpened steel. Their plan was simple. They would slip into the queen's chambers that night and end her reign quietly. With Eleanor Hart gone, they believed they could place their own leader upon the throne and erase Daniel's name from the trial forever. They hid their blades in cloth and moved like shadows through the stone halls. Daniel had gone to fetch water when his ears caught the sound of footsteps moving too carefully near the queen's quarters. The whispers were sharp, filled with hate. He followed without thinking, though his heart throbbed with fear. The closer he came, the clearer it became. These were not men on watch. They were assassins. He knew he was not the strongest. He had no grand weapon, no giant strength to fight them all. Still, he stepped into their path with his plain wooden blade. His voice did not shake when he shouted for them to stop. The assassins turned, surprised to see him standing there. Then cruel laughter filled the corridor. Samuel stepped forward among them with fire in his face. "You think the queen is safe because of you?" Samuel said with a hateful grin. "You think being chosen makes you something more? Tonight, we end you and her both." Daniel's hands trembled on the hilt of his blade, but he did not step aside. He knew if he moved, if he let them pass, the queen would die. Fear pressed against him harder than any strike he had ever taken, but he planted his feet and stood firm. The assassins charged. Steel flashed in the torchlight. Daniel moved faster than even he expected. He ducked beneath the first swing, letting the blade cut air instead of his skin. He turned with a strike of his own, not strong, but placed precisely against the man's knee, sending him to the ground with a shout. Another rushed at him, and Daniel sidestepped again, striking the attacker's arm so the blade fell free. It was not brute power that guided him. It was instinct, sharp and alive. Every swing he avoided, every step he took, seemed to come from a hidden rhythm inside him. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. He was no longer the stumbling weakling they mocked. It was something different, something faster and harder to catch. The clash of footsteps and shouts reached the guards. Within moments, real soldiers arrived to secure the queen's chambers. The assassins were forced to the ground. Samuel shouted bitter curses, his face twisted with fury as they dragged him away. Daniel stood breathing heavy, his chest and arms aching, but still standing. The queen appeared then, her eyes firm but calm as always. She looked at him with a silence that weighed more than words, then stepped closer and placed her hand on his shoulder.
"Oh, you chose to stand when no one else would," she said in her steady voice.
"For that, you carry more strength than the rest." Daniel looked at her with eyes wet from exhaustion and relief. For the first time in his life, he felt not like the weakest, but like someone who mattered. And standing under the queen's gaze, he knew his path was only just beginning. The trials reached their final stage. Weeks of battle and hardship had passed, and now only two names remained upon the lips of the people. The first was Elias Ward, a warrior known for his size and power. His shoulders were as broad as stone gates, and his axe could cut through shields with a single swing. Many called him Earth's strongest, the man most certain to win glory. The second name was Daniel Carter, once mocked as the weakest of the weak. His survival through every round and his defense of the queen herself had turned laughter into uneasy silence. People had begun to watch him with new eyes, though disbelief still lingered in their hearts. The sun was high when the arena filled. Dust rose with each cheer from the gathered crowd of warriors, nobles, and common folk. At the center of the arena stood the two men. Elias with his mighty axe, his broad chest gleaming with sweat, and Daniel holding only a plain blade. The difference between them was beyond measure. The crowd whispered that Daniel would surely fall in moments, that no patience nor trick could withstand the storm of Elias Ward. The horn sounded, and the final trial began. Elias charged with all the force of a mountain. His axe came down heavy, sending a shock through the arena floor when it struck the sand. Daniel was not there when it landed. He had stepped aside, his eyes fixed and steady. The crowd gasped. Elias swung again, faster this time, the wide blade slicing the air. Daniel ducked and wove around him, keeping just far enough not to be caught. His movements were not graceful like Caroline's, but they were sharp and careful. Elias roared with anger as the battle stretched. He was used to crushing men in moments, not chasing them in circles. Each strike he made burned more of his strength. His chest heaved as his arms grew slower. Daniel did not waste strength. He struck only when there was opening, each blow small but well placed. He struck Ilias's wrist, his knee, and the side of his ribs. None were enough to defeat him at once, but together they began to weigh down the giant. The crowd grew restless. At first they had laughed at Daniel's cautious moves. Now they began to murmur at the sight of Elias slowing. Then the queen leaned forward on her seat, her sharp eyes watching every movement. Samuel, chained among the traitors, snarled in his defeat, his eyes burning with hate as he saw Daniel still rise where he had failed. Then the turning moment came. Elias lifted his axe high above his head and swung down with all his remaining might, certain to end the fight. But Daniel stepped aside at the perfect beat, letting the weapon crash into the ground with a thundering sound. The axe caught in the sand, its weight too great. In that heartbeat of weakness, Daniel struck. His blade slid across Elias's shoulder, and then a second strike landed at his side. The giant stumbled forward and fell with a cry, his weapon torn from his grip. The silence that followed was louder than the cheers had been. All eyes turned to Daniel Carter, the boy they had once called Earth's weakest. He stood in the dust, his body tired, his hands trembling, yet his stance steady. Elias Ward, the strongest, lay at his feet, unable to rise. Then the roar of the crowd shook the sky. The sound was not laughter anymore, but awe. The queen raised her hand, and silence fell again. Her voice carried across the arena with power. Daniel Carter has stood where none believed he could. He faced strength with patience and power with heart. He has carried the fire within him to victory. The queen's guards placed a cloak upon Daniel's shoulders. The people bowed, not in mockery, but in respect. Daniel's eyes filled with fire. He had no crown, no great armor, yet the mark of the apex had spoken true. He was no longer the fragile boy hidden in the shadows. He was a hunter who had proven his place against the greatest. From that day forward, none called him weak again. The story of Daniel Carter was woven into the honor of Earth. He had shown them that greatness is not always born in muscle or height. Sometimes it is born in the heart that refuses to fall.